17-year-old Maya had never spoken about the photograph she kept in her jacket pocket, the one of a woman with her smile and a man with her father's eyes. Her grandmother had given it to her 5 years ago with only 3 words: "They loved you." After that, nothing. No names, no explanations, just the weight of that photograph and the silence that followed. By day, Maya moved through her foster home and school like a ghost, present but untethered. By night, she walked to Mercy Cemetery, a sprawling garden of stone and memory where people visited their dead, mourned their losses, and sometimes forgot to return. Over months, Maya began leaving small drawings on unmarked and neglected graves: a child's crayon sketch of a bird, a pressed flower taped beside a name worn smooth by time, a pencil portrait of a face she'd imagined. She never spoke to anyone about it. It wasn't performance or plea. It was simply what her hands needed to do. Then, one autumn morning, a stranger approached her in the cemetery, a man with weathered hands and desperate eyes, and asked her name. What followed was a chain of revelations that would unravel the truth her grandmother had protected, lead her to faces she thought she'd never see, and prove that kindness, no matter how quietly given, finds its way home. This is the story of how Maya learned that sometimes the dead speak louder than the living, and that redemption often begins in the places we think are ending. Chapter 1. The Girl at the Gate. The iron gate of Mercy Cemetery creaked the same way it always did, a sound like something ancient waking. Maya had heard it so many times now that it felt less like a door opening and more like a greeting, a voice saying, "You're back. Good. Come in." It was a Tuesday in September, the kind of afternoon that held summer's warmth in the air but carried autumn's chill underneath. The light was turning gold at the edges of the trees, that particular slant of light that made everything look like it was being remembered rather than lived. Maya moved through the rows with practiced quietness, her canvas bag slung across her chest. Inside were colored pencils, sketchbooks, pressed flowers from the park near her foster home, and a small jar of tape. She moved past the elaborate family plots with their polished granite and fresh flowers. That wasn't where she went. She moved deeper, toward the older section where the graves grew smaller and further apart, where the names on the stones had faded to thin shadows. She stopped at one, a child's grave, the stone barely waist-high, dated 1994. The name was still legible: Emma Catherine Morse. 1992-1994, beloved daughter, 29 years. Maya checked her small notebook. She'd left a drawing here 6 weeks ago. She did this, kept track. Every grave she visited, she wrote down the date. Sometimes she came back after months to see if the drawing had survived, if rain had smudged it, if wind had torn it away. Most times the evidence was gone. But occasionally, a drawing lingered, caught under a stone, protected by some accident of geometry. This time her pencil sketch of a girl with flowers in her hair was still there, sealed beneath a smooth piece of river rock. Someone had placed it carefully, deliberately, not carelessly, not vandalized or removed in anger. Placed, tended. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she set down her bag. This had never happened before. She'd left hundreds of drawings over the past 3 years. She'd never checked on them, never expected them to still be there. But this one was preserved, and it made her throat tight in a way she couldn't explain. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to draw. This time it was a bird. Not realistic, but suggested, almost abstract. A shape that could be any bird, every bird. A bird that was freedom and memory and the kind of longing that lives in the chest before it reaches the throat. She used blue and grey and one thin line of gold. It took her 20 minutes. When she finished, she taped it carefully beside the preserved drawing, as if the two were meant to speak to each other, as if they were a conversation across time. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. The cemetery was quiet, and she'd grown used to that quiet, the way it felt like the dead were listening, or at least not interrupting. But footsteps broke through it, and Maya's shoulders tensed. A man stood perhaps 10 feet away. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of lined face that came from decades of sun and weather. He wore a brown jacket, and in his hands he held a small arrangement of white flowers. Chrysanthemums, she thought, though she wasn't certain. She wasn't good with flowers yet. That was something she was still learning. "Did you do that?" he asked. His voice was rough, but not unkind. Maya didn't move. She rarely spoke to anyone at the cemetery. She came here to be alone, or rather, to be alone with the dead. Other people who came to visit their graves sometimes nodded at her, but they didn't approach. Most people didn't want to acknowledge one another here. Acknowledgement made everything more real. "The drawing," he continued, stepping slightly closer. "The one beneath the rock." "Yes," Maya said quietly. The man looked at the preserved sketch, then at the fresh bird she'd just placed. His expression was difficult to read, something between confusion and recognition, the way a person looks at something they've forgotten they were searching for. "How long have you been leaving drawings here?" he asked. Maya considered not answering. She considered gathering her things and walking back toward the gate, but something in his voice held her, not demand, but genuine need. The need of someone who had been waiting for an answer without knowing the question. 3 years, she said, almost 4. The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked directly at her, and his eyes were suddenly wet. "I'm looking for my granddaughter," he said. "I've been searching for 5 years, and I found a drawing in my daughter's house, one that matches these. She left it there. She never told me why. She wouldn't say who did it." He paused. "My daughter. She comes here sometimes to visit her sister. She must have found your work and brought it home to protect it." Maya felt something shift in her chest, like a door swinging open slowly. "My granddaughter was taken from us," he continued. "We've been trying to find her ever since. I don't even know what she looks like now. But my daughter has been keeping your drawings. She places them herself sometimes, I think, in the graves she visits." Maya stared at him. The words didn't connect properly at first. They floated, unmoored, waiting for her to grab hold of them. "What's your name?" the man asked. "Maya," she whispered, and something in his face shifted again, a recognition sharp and sudden, like a key finding its lock. "That was her mother's middle name," he said very quietly. "That was my daughter's name, Maya." Chapter 2. The Photograph. The man's name was David Crane, and he insisted on sitting with Maya on a bench near the cemetery gate. He held the white chrysanthemums in his lap, like they might explain something if he held them long enough. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to be honest with me. When did you last see your biological family?" Maya had prepared for many versions of this question in her life. She'd imagined social workers asking it. She'd rehearsed answers in the mirror. But hearing it asked by this stranger, by someone who seemed to already know the answer, unmade her. "I was 12, she said. It was the first honest thing she'd said in 3 years. Not to her foster parents, not to her school counselors, not even to herself. But somehow, sitting beside this man in a cemetery in September light, honesty felt like the only available language. My grandmother gave me a photograph. She said my parents loved me, and then she died 2 weeks later. I've been in foster care since. I don't remember their faces. Not really. The photograph helps, but—" She trailed off. How could she explain that memory worked differently than people thought, that a face could fade even when you held its image? That absence was a kind of erosion. David reached into his jacket pocket. His hands shook slightly as he withdrew a worn envelope. He opened it with the care someone might use to open a sealed tomb, slowly, reverently, as if the contents were precious beyond measure. Inside was a photograph, faded, handled many times. It showed a woman with warm eyes and a man with the kind of smile that looked like it knew secrets. And in the woman's arms, wrapped in a pink blanket, was an infant with a small tuft of dark hair. "This is my daughter Maya," David said, pointing to the woman. "And this is her husband, Robert, and this—" he pointed to the infant. "This is their daughter. This is you." Maya's vision blurred. She reached for the photograph, but her hands were shaking too much. She pulled them back. "My daughter and her husband were killed in a car accident when you were 3 weeks old," David continued, his voice steady despite the tears that now ran freely down his face. "I was raising you. We were raising you. Your grandmother, my wife. She had you most days while I worked. One afternoon she took you to the park. She said afterward that she turned around for only a moment. Only a moment. And you were gone." The cemetery seemed to tilt. Maya gripped the edge of the bench. "They searched for months, years. The police investigated, but you were never found. Your grandmother never recovered. She spent the rest of her life looking at every child she passed, wondering if it was you, wondering if you were alive, wondering if you remembered us." David looked at her now, truly looked at her, as if cataloguing every feature of her face. "When you were taken, you had this birthmark," he said, reaching out. His weathered finger gently touched the inside of her left wrist, where a small, faint mark shaped like a crescent moon resided. Maya had never thought about it before. It was simply part of her, as unremarkable as breathing. "I have that mark, too," David whispered. "It runs in our family. Your grandmother had it. Your mother has it." Maya couldn't breathe properly. The sound of the cemetery, wind in the trees, distant traffic, the hum of the city beyond the gates, all of it seemed to be happening inside her chest. "My daughter never stopped looking for you," David continued. "She kept your room exactly as it was. She used to go to the cemetery and sit by her sister's grave, and she found your drawings. She started collecting them, and she asked me to help her find you. That's why I come here now. That's why I've started visiting the graves of children." He held out the photograph again, and this time Maya took it. Her hands were steadier now, though tears blurred the image. "Your name," David said, "is not Maya Chen or whatever name they gave you in foster care. Your name is Eleanor Catherine Crane. You were named after my mother and your grandmother. You are my granddaughter, and you came home today." Chapter 3. Voices in the Stone. Eleanor, for that's who she was now, though the name felt like clothing that didn't quite fit yet, didn't speak for the entire car ride. David drove slowly, as if the speed of the car might determine how much time she had to adjust to the truth. The route took them through the city and into suburbs Eleanor didn't recognize, though every street corner seemed to whisper something familiar, as if her bones remembered what her mind could not. David filled the silence with a gentle voice, telling her about her parents, about how her mother, Maya Crane, had loved to paint, about how her father, Robert, had played guitar, about how her grandmother, Catherine, had made bread every Sunday and had Eleanor sit on a stool beside her in the kitchen, even though Eleanor was too small to actually help. He described these moments like they were scenes from a film he'd watched so many times he could recite them exactly. "You have her artist's hands," David said at a red light, glancing at Eleanor's fingers. "Your mother's. You draw. That wasn't an accident, I think." Eleanor looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. 3 years of leaving drawings on graves. 3 years of her hands, moving across paper with something like certainty, even when her mind was fractured. Had her mother's hands always moved that way? Did art live in the blood, coded into cells, passed down like the crescent birthmark? They pulled into a neighborhood of old houses with wide porches. The trees were tall and established, the kind of trees that took decades to grow. David's house was a pale blue Victorian with a garden that had been loved and then abandoned. Flowers still bloomed in the beds, but they were wild now, untended, beautiful in their disorder. His daughter was waiting on the porch. Eleanor knew this from the way David parked the car, from the sudden steadying of his breathing. Maya Crane was 43 years old, though she looked younger and older simultaneously, as if grief had stolen certain years from her life while aging her in other ways. She had Eleanor's eyes. Not similar to them. The exact same eyes, with the same way of holding warmth and distance at the same moment. She didn't rush down the steps. She stood very still, as if Eleanor might disappear if she moved too quickly. "Hi," Eleanor said. The word was barely audible. "Hi," her mother replied. Then, "I'm Maya, I'm your mother." The word mother hung in the air between them like something sacred and terrifying. Eleanor had spent 12 years with a mother, a foster mother who was kind enough, who made dinner and signed permission slips, but she had never had this mother. This woman who had spent 30 years looking for her, who had kept drawings from a stranger in a cemetery, who had turned grief into the shape of searching. Maya descended the steps slowly and knelt in front of Eleanor. She didn't touch her, just looked at her, just catalogued her face the way David had done. "I've been leaving drawings," Eleanor said. The words came out in a rush. "On graves. For 3 years. I didn't know why, I felt like I had to, like someone was asking me to." "I know," Maya said, and her voice broke. "I found them. I've been collecting them." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small stack of sketches, all Eleanor's work, all carefully preserved. The bird from the park, a silhouette of a woman in profile, a child's hand holding a flower. Drawings Eleanor had made in the depths of her loneliness, and a mother had gathered them as if they were letters in a language only she could read. Eleanor reached out and touched her mother's face, just the tip of her fingers on Maya's cheek, testing the reality of it. Her mother didn't move. She let herself be touched like a wild thing that might startle. Comment where you're watching from. These stories of kindness connect hearts across the world. Chapter 4. The room that waited inside the house. Everything smelled like time. Not old, but preserved. Eleanor's mother led her upstairs, and David followed silently behind, letting his daughter have this moment. They stopped in front of a white door. Maya's hand trembled as she turned the knob. The room was small and held the light of an autumn afternoon like a prayer. There was a white crib, still assembled, still waiting. Next to it, a rocking chair with a faded quilt folded over its arm. On the walls, drawings, not Eleanor's, but others. Watercolors and pencil sketches of the landscape around the house, and above the changing table, a mobile of birds hanging still in the quiet air. "I painted those when I was pregnant," Maya said softly. She pointed to the watercolors. "All the scenes I wanted to show you, all the things I wanted you to see." Eleanor moved through the room like she was walking through a memory that belonged to someone else. She touched the quilt. She looked at the birds on the mobile. She stood in front of a large framed photograph on the dresser, a picture of her parents, young and radiant, holding an infant. Eleanor herself, wrapped in pink, with her eyes closed as if she were dreaming. "After you disappeared," Maya continued, "I couldn't change anything. Your father wanted to. He said it hurt to see it, but I couldn't. I thought if I changed even one thing, it would mean I'd given up. It would mean I was accepting that you weren't coming back." She sat down on the edge of the crib. The mattress was still covered in a soft white sheet, though it had yellowed slightly with time. "After your father died," Maya continued, "I almost changed it. I almost packed it all away. But my father stopped me. He said that you might come back. He said that he could feel it sometimes, a presence in the house, like someone was asking to be remembered. And so I kept it. I kept everything. I told people it was morbid. I told myself it was faith. Maybe it was both. Eleanor turned to look at her mother, this woman who had lived in a house of ghosts and hope for 30 years. "I didn't know," Eleanor said. "I didn't remember you." "I know," Maya said. She looked up at Eleanor with eyes that had learned to hold sorrow without drowning in it. "But something in you remembered. Something in you needed to honor the dead. And I think that something was listening to me. I think some part of you could hear me calling." Eleanor sat down on the floor in front of her mother. She didn't cry, though her chest felt like it was carved from ice. "I'd left drawings on graves because I was looking for something," Eleanor said, trying to articulate what she'd always felt, but never understood. "I was looking for a face I couldn't remember, a name I didn't know. I was drawing pictures for people I didn't know, trying to remember people I'd forgotten." "Yes," Maya said. "You were drawing your way home." She reached down and pulled Eleanor toward her, and Eleanor let herself be held by this stranger who was her mother. The embrace was careful, as if they were both afraid the other might break. But gradually, Eleanor relaxed into it. She could smell something familiar, not a memory she could place, but something her body recognized. The scent of her mother's skin, coded into her cells from the womb, waiting to be remembered. They stayed like that for a long time, in the room that had been kept like a shrine, in the house that had never stopped waiting, while the afternoon light turned gold and then amber and the birds on the mobile hung motionless in the quiet air. Chapter 5. The letter. Eleanor lived with her mother and grandfather for 6 weeks before they decided to go back to the cemetery together. The weeks between her discovery and this return were strange, full of conversations that sometimes felt like filling in a massive missing puzzle, and sometimes felt like trying to speak a language she'd forgotten. David told her stories about her parents. Her mother showed her the room she'd grown up in before the accident, showed her photographs and videos Eleanor herself didn't remember. They drove through the city, and occasionally something would trigger a fragment of memory. The way a certain park bench was painted, the sound of a specific street corner, the smell of a particular bakery. Eleanor's mother had taken a leave from her job at a design firm. She spent her days with Eleanor, introducing her to extended family members who cried openly and held her too tightly, who asked 1,000 questions about where she'd been and what her life had been like, and who all wore her father's eyes in different configurations. But mostly, Eleanor and her mother sat together. They didn't always talk. Often they simply occupied the same space, reading in the same room, cooking meals together, or sitting in the garden where Eleanor's mother had always painted but hadn't created anything new in 5 years. Then, one morning, Eleanor's mother came downstairs with a shoebox. "I want to show you something," she said. They sat on the kitchen table and Maya opened the box. Inside were dozens of drawings, all of Eleanor's work, organized by date. The earliest ones were crude, barely recognizable as anything intentional. But as Eleanor moved through the chronology, they became more sophisticated, more detailed, more alive. "I collected everyone I could find," Maya said. "I traced the dates from your sketches. You've been coming to the cemetery for 3 years and 7 months. That means you started when you were 13. Eleanor did the math in her head. 13. The year after her grandmother died. The year after she'd received the photograph and then lost it all to silence. "Your grandmother," Maya said carefully. "She passed away the 2nd month you were drawing. I don't know how you knew that. I don't know if you sensed it somehow or if it was just coincidence, but that's when your drawings changed. They became sadder, more intentional, like you were trying to communicate something." Eleanor looked at the drawings, evidence of her own grief, her own longing, all preserved in her mother's hands like a message in bottles that had finally washed ashore. "I want to do something," Maya said, "if you're willing. I want to create something at the cemetery, something permanent, something that honors what you've been doing." A week later, they stood in front of a small section of the cemetery that the director, after hearing their story, had agreed to let them develop. The space had been overgrown and neglected, a corner where graves were too old to be visited regularly, where the stones had sunk and weeds had claimed the space. Eleanor and her mother had spent the week designing. Eleanor sketched. Her mother refined the designs using her architectural background, and now, with a small team of volunteers, they were creating something that no one had expected. It was a garden memorial, a space where the oldest and most neglected graves would be tended. They planted flowers specifically chosen to bloom across seasons. They cleaned and restored the stones, not erasing the weathering but stabilizing it. And in the center, they placed a stone bench with a plaque that read, "For the forgotten beloved, for the hands that remember. For kindness shown to those the world overlooks. For Eleanor Catherine Crane, who drew flowers on the graves of strangers and found her way home. May we all remember, every grave matters, every soul deserves to be honored." On the day they dedicated the garden, Eleanor stood with her mother's hand in hers. Her grandfather was there, her extended family was there, and people from the neighborhood came too, people who had loved ones in this forgotten corner of the cemetery, people who had never expected to see these graves honored. Eleanor thought about all the drawings she'd left over 3 years, all the small acts of kindness that had seemed so meaningless at the time. She'd been leaving them without knowing, for herself, for her parents, for her grandmother, for all the lost souls who were waiting to be remembered. "Thank you for coming back," her mother whispered. Eleanor squeezed her hand. "I was always coming back," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." Chapter 6. The photograph returns home. 3 months later, Eleanor hung the original photograph, the one of her parents holding her as an infant, on her bedroom wall. Her new bedroom, in her mother's house, in the room next to the one that had been preserved like a shrine. She'd asked to move her things from her foster home 6 weeks after finding her mother. The social services department had processed it quickly once David hired a lawyer, and the truth of Eleanor's identity was confirmed through DNA tests. There had been an investigation into how Eleanor had come to be taken from the cemetery all those years ago. But the trail had grown too cold. No one was ever found. The case became another mystery the city held in its margins. Eleanor didn't think about the gap often anymore. Or rather, she thought about it differently. Those years had not been erased. They had been lived by someone, a different version of Eleanor, a ghost self who had learned to move through the world alone. That Eleanor had found solace in drawing, in creating small moments of beauty in forgotten places, and that Eleanor had somehow, through an act of grace she still didn't fully understand, left a trail that led her home. Today, though, Eleanor was thinking about the photograph because her mother had asked her to help with a project. Maya wanted to create a book, a photo essay of the cemetery garden, combined with Eleanor's drawings, combined with stories from people who had used the space. A book about how small acts of kindness ripple outward, how memory survives, how connection can bloom in the places we least expect. "I want your art to be the center of it," her mother said. They sat together in the studio her mother had set up, a bright room on the 2nd floor, where light came through big windows that overlooked the garden. Not just the drawings from the cemetery, but all of them, the ones from over the years, your journey documented in pencil and charcoal and color. Eleanor looked at the walls, where her mother had begun arranging sketches. 3 years of work, 3 years of seeking without knowing what she was seeking for. "There's something I want to ask you," Eleanor said. "The foster family I lived with, the social workers, none of them ever saw what I was doing. None of them asked about the drawings or the time I spent at the cemetery. How did no one notice I was grieving?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. "Because grief in children is often invisible," she said. "Adults see what they're looking for, and most people are looking for crisis, loud crying, acting out obvious pain. But you were grieving quietly. You were creating. You were leaving flowers for the dead. That looked like hobbies to them, not like someone drowning. But you noticed, Eleanor said. I was looking for you, her mother replied. I was paying attention to the signs, and I found them. Eleanor thought about this as she looked at her drawings. Each one had been an act of searching. Each one had been a prayer written in pencil. That evening, Eleanor sat at her desk and wrote a letter. She didn't write it to her mother or grandfather or the extended family that had now claimed her. She wrote it to her grandmother, to Catherine, who had lost Eleanor in a park and spent the rest of her life looking, who had finally told Eleanor the truth before she died. Dear grandmother, I found my way home. I don't know how, but I did. I think you helped me. I think you left a trail through the years, a feeling, a knowing, something in my bones that remembered you. Mum says that I started drawing at the cemetery the year you died. I think maybe you called me there. I think maybe you asked me to remember. I'm drawing again now, but differently. I'm drawing with intention. I'm drawing to honor the dead and the living both. I'm drawing to make meaning from loss, and I'm drawing to tell the world that grief is love with no place to go, until someone finds a way to make it matter. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for never letting me disappear completely. I'm home now. I'm home. She folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. Tomorrow she would place it at her grandmother's grave in the memorial garden. It would weather and fade, the ink dissolving into the rain. The words would become illegible. But the act of leaving it there, that would matter. That would be a kindness shown to the dead, a remembrance, a promise that she had not been forgotten. If this story has already touched your heart, hit the like button. It helps the message of compassion reach more people who need hope. Chapter 7. The Student. By spring, Eleanor had been reunited with her family for nearly a year. She was 18 now. Her birthday had passed in January, celebrated with a cake her mother had baked and a family dinner that still felt both familiar and new. She was also enrolled in art school, not full-time, but in evening classes at the community college while she finished her high school diploma. Her teachers had noticed her work immediately, particularly one instructor, a woman named Professor Chen, who had been moved by Eleanor's portfolio. Your technique is solid, Professor Chen had said, but what strikes me is the emotional weight. Most young artists are technical or emotional, rarely both. You have something else going on. Where does it come from? Eleanor had told her the story. Not everything, not the kidnapping or the foster care or the cemetery drawings specifically, but she told her about loss, about searching, about the way art becomes a language when words fail. Professor Chen had been quiet for a long time. Then she'd said, "You need to study with me, formally. I don't normally take on students, but I think your work matters. I think what you have to say matters." Now, 3 months into lessons, Eleanor was learning techniques for preservation, for making art that would last, how to seal drawings against water damage, how to frame them properly, how to create installations that could withstand the elements. "What you've been doing at the cemetery," Professor Chen said during one lesson, "leaving art on graves, that's conservation of a different kind. You're preserving memory. That's as important as preserving technique." Eleanor thought about this as she worked on a series of charcoal drawings, portraits of her grandmother and her parents, recreated from photographs and memory and feeling. In one, her grandmother held infant Eleanor. In another, her mother and father looked out at a future they never reached. In the third, Eleanor herself, drawn from her own reflection, looking back at the camera with eyes that had learned both sorrow and hope. "I want to create something permanent," Eleanor told her mother one evening. They were in the memorial garden, tending to the flowers that had taken root over the seasons. Something that tells the story of what happened, not just for our family, but for everyone who's lost someone. Her mother knelt in the soil, her hands dark with earth. When she looked up, Eleanor could see that she was already envisioning it. "A monument," she said. It wasn't a question. "A garden within the garden," Eleanor said. "A place where people can leave drawings or photographs or words. A place where grief becomes beautiful instead of just painful. Your grandfather would want to help fund it," her mother said. "He's been looking for a way to do something meaningful with his foundation. This would be perfect." Over the next several months, Eleanor worked with her mother and grandfather to design what they called the Remembrance Garden. It would be a circular space at the heart of the memorial garden, with stone benches arranged to face inward. The walls would be covered with large panels of durable glass, surfaces where people could affix photographs, drawings, written memories. There would be a small shelter with supplies, colored pencils, paper, watercolors, an invitation for visitors to create, to remember, to honor their dead, not in silence but through art. The groundbreaking happened on a spring morning. Local press came, drawn by the human interest angle of Eleanor's story. She agreed to one interview, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that publicity would help attract visitors and resources. "What do you want people to take away from this space?" the journalist asked. Eleanor thought about all the afternoons she'd spent in the cemetery alone, leaving drawings on graves. She thought about her mother finding them, collecting them, searching for the artist. She thought about the moment her grandfather had recognized something in her work, some trace of the granddaughter he'd been looking for. "I want them to know that grief doesn't end," Eleanor said. "It changes. It becomes part of you. But the dead shouldn't be forgotten just because they're gone. And if we can transform that grief into something beautiful, into art, into remembrance, into acts of kindness, then loss becomes less lonely. It becomes shared. It becomes sacred." The journalist wrote about Eleanor's words, about her journey, about the garden that would bear her story. The article appeared in the newspaper and was picked up by regional outlets. Eleanor received letters from across the country, from people who had lost loved ones, from artists who were inspired by her work, from others who had experienced their own disappearances and returns. Among these letters was one from a woman named Sarah. She wrote to say that she had kept her own drawings in a cemetery for years, leaving them on the graves of her deceased children, that she had thought she was alone in this practice until she read about Eleanor. "Your story gave me permission to stop hiding," Sarah wrote, "to stop thinking my grief was strange or morbid, to believe that honoring the dead through art was not only valid, but sacred." Eleanor saved this letter. She added it to a growing collection of testimonies that would eventually be displayed in the Remembrance Garden. Proof that she was not alone in her need to create meaning from loss, that many people across the world were searching for the same grace. Chapter 8. The Opening. The Remembrance Garden was completed in October, almost exactly 1 year after Eleanor had placed her first drawing on her grandmother's grave in the memorial garden. The morning of the opening was cool and bright. The trees had begun to turn, golds and deep reds mixing with the green. The garden looked like it had always been there, even though the soil was still fresh and the plantings were young. Eleanor stood in the center of the circular space, looking at the glass panels. They were mostly empty now, waiting to be filled with the memories and art of visitors. But 3 panels already held permanent installations. Eleanor's drawings, the best of the 3 years she'd spent creating at the cemetery, her mother's paintings, and a series of photographs that tracked Eleanor's life. Her as an infant with her parents, her foster family photos, and then the recent ones, Eleanor with her mother, Eleanor with her grandfather, Eleanor at art school, Eleanor covered in garden soil with her hands stained dark. The journey documented, the story visible, the return complete. Hundreds of people came to the opening. Eleanor's family was there. Her foster parents came. and Eleanor was grateful. They had kept her safe, had provided stability in a fractured life. They approached her awkwardly, aware now of what they had inadvertently been guarding. A lost granddaughter, a girl whose entire identity had been obscured. "We're proud of you," her foster mother said. She was crying. "I hope you know that. Whatever happened before us, we loved you while we had you." Eleanor hugged them both. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping me safe, for giving me time to find my way home." Local artists displayed work. A string quartet played. Her mother's photography studio displayed a series of before and after photos of the cemetery garden, the neglected space transformed into something beautiful and maintained. And Eleanor stood in the center and watched strangers leave drawings on the glass panels. A woman placed a portrait of her deceased daughter. A man left a child's drawing, one he'd found after his granddaughter died and he'd wanted to preserve. An elderly couple placed a photograph of themselves in their wedding clothes with a note, "For the children we never had." The remembrance garden filled with stories. It filled with grief transformed into beauty. It filled with the visual evidence that loss could be honored, that the dead could be remembered not in silence and solitude, but in community and creativity. As the sun began to set, Eleanor walked the perimeter of the garden. She touched the glass panels. She read the stories that were beginning to accumulate, and she thought about the other girl, the ghost self, who had left drawings on graves not knowing that she was searching for her own family. That girl was gone now, or rather, she was integrated, incorporated into this new self. Eleanor was no longer fractured between then and now, between before and after, between the person she'd been in the cemetery alone and the person she'd become when she was found. She was whole, not because her loss had been erased, but because it had been witnessed, honored, and transformed into something that mattered. Chapter 9. The Gift. 6 months after the opening of the Remembrance Garden, Eleanor received a package at her mother's house. It had no return address, only her name written in careful elderly handwriting. Inside was a journal, not new but old, the pages yellowed, some of them dog-eared and worn. And on the first page, in the same handwriting as the address, were these words, "For Eleanor Catherine Crane, from the artist who created these drawings before you were born." Read this, and you will understand that everything is connected. Eleanor opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with sketches, drawings, and paintings from decades past, and slowly, as she moved through the journal, she realized she was looking at work by her grandmother. Not her paternal grandmother, Catherine, whom Eleanor had never met, but a woman named Helen Crane, her grandmother on her father's side, a woman who had been an artist, who had filled this journal over 50 years ago with drawings of loss, of grief, of memory, of women in gardens, of children's faces, of hands reaching across emptiness. At the end of the journal was a letter. "My dear Eleanor, I was your father's mother. I died before you were born, but I left you something I could not leave him, a visual language for grief. Your father never inherited my artistic ability, but you did. It moved through the generations until it reached you. I spent my entire life drawing the dead, people I loved and had lost. For years, I thought I was wasting my time, creating beauty from a darkness that no one wanted to acknowledge. But I now understand, wherever I am beyond this life, that what you're doing is what I was always trying to do: transform loss into love, make the dead visible, prove that they mattered. You are the completion of something I began. You are the artist I hoped my son would be. You are the redemption of all my years of drawing in grief. Paint the world beautiful, Eleanor. Honor the dead through art. And know that you are connected to all of us who came before you, all the women in your family who loved too deeply and grieved too fiercely. We are with you. With eternal love, Helen Crane Eleanor closed the journal, her hands trembling. She showed it to her mother, who wept openly. "I never knew," her mother said. "Your father never talked about his mother. He said it was too painful. But this is everything. This explains so much." Eleanor looked at her grandmother's drawings and then at the current work hanging on her studio walls. The same themes, the same longing, the same attempt to make meaning from loss through the language of art, a thread connecting across generations, women creating, women grieving, women transforming sorrow into beauty. That evening, Eleanor placed the journal on a display in the Remembrance Garden in a glass case protected from the elements. She wanted visitors to see it. She wanted them to understand that grief is not aberrant or strange. It's a thread that runs through families, through time, through generations. She created a new series of paintings after that, large-scale works that featured her grandmother's drawings alongside her own. A visual conversation across decades. A dialogue between two women who had never met, but who were communicating through the language of art and loss. One painting was called Hands Across Time. It showed Eleanor's grandmother's hands holding a pencil, creating a drawing of a grave, and Eleanor's hands, decades later, doing the same thing. Their hands overlapped in the middle, creating something neither could have made alone. The painting was purchased by a museum after its exhibition at the community college. Eleanor never expected to see her work in a public institution, but there it was, evidence that her journey mattered, that her art mattered, that the attempt to honor loss through creativity could resonate beyond the personal into something universal. A year after receiving the journal, Eleanor turned 19. She was no longer in the liminal space of discovery. She was grounded in her identity, Eleanor Catherine Crane, artist, granddaughter, daughter, survivor, seeker. She existed now in the fullness of her history rather than fragmented by it. On her birthday, her mother and grandfather gave her a key. It was to a studio, a small space in the Arts District, funded by her grandfather's foundation, where Eleanor could work full-time on her art. "This is yours," her grandfather said, "a place for your vision to grow, a place where you can create the beauty you've been searching for." Eleanor stood in the studio, empty and waiting and full of possibility, and thought about the girl who had drawn pictures on graves. That girl had been searching too. She'd been searching for a home, for a family, for a reason her hands needed to move across paper with such intensity and certainty. And she had found it. Not through grand gestures, but through quiet acts of kindness, repeated over and over, until they created a path that led her home. Eleanor picked up a piece of charcoal and approached the blank canvas. She would spend the next year creating her most ambitious work yet, a series of paintings that would tell the complete story of her journey. From loss to finding, from cemetery graves to the Remembrance Garden, from ghost self to integrated whole, the charcoal met the canvas, and Eleanor began to create, drawing herself home, one mark at a time. Epilogue. In the Remembrance Garden, beneath the oldest oak tree, Eleanor planted a final stone, not a grave marker, but a cornerstone. It read, "For those who are lost and those who seek. For the hands that remember when the heart has forgotten, for the art that survives grief, for home. Subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and redemption. Thank you for watching the story of Eleanor Catherine Crane. Let's keep spreading the light."